What is architecture?
Architecture is, I think, one of the best ways of prompting people to think about how the world could be other than what it is, other than the kind of everyday reality that we're constantly bombarded by. And I really believe in this. As much as the world often tries to portray architecture as a kind of solution to problems, social ills, engineering problems, those kinds of things, I think that while it does those, and I admit that it does those and needs to do those things, I think that that's not really what it's best at. I think that if you look at some of the most canonical architecture in the world, you see that it's operating on an entirely different level than that. Like, it's taking care of those things that it needs to do, but it's problematizing things, I guess, is what I would say, rather than solving problems, which is a totally different thing. So, like, as an example, I was just driving by the Enos house from Frank Lloyd Wright this weekend, which I love doing because it's absolutely shocking and creepy and also kind of part of the LA landscape. So it's part of our reality here, and we understand it as such. Yet the minute you do a bit of a close read on it, you realize there's all kinds of other things going on there. For instance, it resists a kind of typological reading, or at least it has an indeterminate typological reading. Like, is this thing house? Is this a civic building? Is this an ancient pyramid? What are we dealing with here? What are we dealing with here? And I love that about it so much. And also, where does the house begin and end? Like, is it sitting on a hill, and is that a retaining wall? And is the house only on top? Or is the house the entire space behind all of the textile block? You don't really know when you look at it. And so it questions our whole idea of ground and how you build on a hillside. Like, he's basically building a mountain on top of a mountain to build a house on top of a mountain. And to me, it's absolutely mind-bending. And that's when I think architecture is doing its best work, when it does that. It forces you to rethink things. What's a house? What's a civic building? And also, what time is a piece of architecture from? Like, this thing feels ancient, and I love that, but it's super contemporary at the same time, So that's like one project. Another one that comes to mind is Henry Cobb's tower in Dallas, which, I don't know if you know that project, but it's a black glass skyscraper. Really, really interesting project, because at first glance, if you just drive by it, your brain might sort of categorize it and say, like, okay, this is an 80s glass skyscraper. It's not even 80s, I think it's earlier than that. But it's one of those, and you kind of categorize it. But if you actually look at it for a second, and I was there recently at an award ceremony, driving by, actually look at it for a second, it's amazing. It's like a tear in the space-time. Like, literally, it's insane. It's crystalline, right? It reads both as two towers and one tower. The facades are done really basically mullionless, so it looks like a black mass of no scale, of any scale, of infinite scale. You can't really tell. And then it's like a black hole where it's sucking in the rest of the city. There's nothing like it around it, too. So basically, it's kind of reflecting back, and it obscures part of the city. It sucks in the city. It reflects the city. It's really quite powerful, and it's also magical how it's done with so few surfaces, and sort of its orientation and placement in a city. So like, that's another one where you go at it and you think you know the world, and you think you know what a late modern high-rise looks like. You think you understand late Capital as well, in terms of repetition of floor plates and core and all of these things. But then you encounter this thing, and it's like, it just blows your mind entirely. So one thing I noticed, I was filming it on my iPhone, which I do a lot lately. I like to film something and then look at it later, and it looks different on the phone. I don't know if you ever do that, but it's like, and one of the things I noticed about the video that I made is that it feels like the building itself is an augmented reality overlay on the city of Dallas. It doesn't even feel like it's there. which was an amazing effect. And I was thinking after I saw that, I was like, okay, so now going forward, every single project that I do has to have that quality where when you film the actual built object, it has to feel like an AR effect to the rest of the world. Then you know that you're questioning reality, the background reality. You know? So
what can architecture do?
Okay, so what can it do? I guess I would like to say it can change the way you think. It can change your sense of freedom. It can change your assumptions about what's possible. It can change the way you think about things that we think are basic social structures. For instance, like what's a street? What's a street? We all assume we know what a street is. What's a street? It can change the way you think about that. What if there were multi-streets? What if there were elevated streets? What if there were underground streets? What if streets were miniature and 5 feet wide? How would that change cities? It can change the way you think about living and working and all the other things that we do that we think we know, and all the assumptions that we make about how we live our lives or move through the world. It can basically make you question all of those things. People try to force architecture into service of doing a lot of other things. And if you look at history, you see how badly that can go. I mean, if you look at Le Corbusier's City for 3 Million, it's an amazing thought project. However, for its time, however, like as executed across the world, it basically homogenizes urban space and has unrealistic ideas about what nature is. And frankly, I think just at this point, just not contemporary ideas about what nature is, and also what constitutes the public realm. So I think. What can it do? It's kind of a difficult question because I could easily descend into issues of performance. And instrumentalization on all different levels, from the social to the technical. But again, I don't think that architecture does its best work when it's instrumentalized in those ways. However, again, I'm understanding of and receptive to the idea that it must also do those things. Of course it has to. But I just think I think that that's not what we should be doing as architects, and it's also what I want to make sure that we're not training our students also at SciArc to do. I think we have to think bigger than that. One thing I was thinking too, and I don't know if this is related to what can architecture do, but I was thinking about the Oscars last night and the Me Too movement and a lot of the heavy political issues that had to be dealt with at that show, which is also very strange because it's entertainment, it's highly controlled and scripted, and yet people want to get out things, current political issues and talk about these things, and it's really one of the only and best ways to do it. But I was thinking about how social change at this point in time is massive, and how it's possible now through the internet and social media and all of that, and how things that we assumed had to be a certain way are all being turned on their head. We assume that Hollywood has a certain kind of hierarchy and corruption to it, but that's been turned on its head. We assume that Chinese and Middle Eastern politics are a certain way, and that they have to remain that way. Yet it gets turned on its head. We even assume that a president is going to follow some basic ethical rules and even just rules of the game, and he doesn't. So a lot of things that we assume are going to happen don't happen now. And so I was thinking, when's the last time that happened? And I was thinking about May '68 in Paris, and what happened then, which was a very similar, although I'd say what's going on now is much less like visceral and violent. It's more intellectual, but it's in a way super similar. And I was thinking, okay, so how does that relate to architecture? And then I was thinking about all of the highly experimental work that came out from Archizoom and Super Studio and actually a bunch of Italian firms. There was this firm called Ziggurat with 2 Z's, Ziggurat. And there was some amazing stuff coming out which started to really critique architecture, especially late modern architecture at the beginning of the 70s. And that brought a whole new wave of ideas about cities and space and humans and all of these kinds of subjects in the 70s and 80s. And I think it really, it got us past the modern project. And I was thinking, okay, so what is this social upheaval that we're going through now, and how will it transform the way architects think? And then I realized that architecture is going the other way right now. It's a kind of time of conservatism, in my opinion. It's a time of austerity in a way, and by that I don't mean economical austerity. I mean austerity, intellectual austerity. And I just find that troublesome because I think that when any kind of social change happens, I think that your vision and your idea about what reality looks like, its aesthetics, the way cities are, the way that groups of people gather together in civilization, all of those things deserve to be rethought. And so I was just thinking anyway, and I know this, just to loop way back around, I was thinking that, like this, at this time, I think it's a great time to be an architect, and we have to engage these issues, but we have to engage them on our own territory, which is architecture. And not kind of drift into other areas where we pretend like we can solve all the problems of the world through architecture. I think we have to be really careful about that. I think architecture is really good at some things, and I think that it's our job now to respond within our discipline and through the profession in a way that resonates in contemporary culture, and be really careful about this rising tide of conservatism. It concerns me. So anyway, I think it's a great time for architecture and for what it can do, I guess.
So what is your architectural position?
Okay. Well, just to the overview from 30,000 feet is that I'm really interested in architecture that doesn't give itself up immediately to the audience. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Like architecture that is opaque in some form such that it can't be consumed quickly. Architecture that you want to return to again and again, and it still has something, which is part of my interest also in contemporary philosophy, especially speculative realism and triple O, is that it kind of accounts for that. But yeah, so architecture that's mysterious and vexing, and again just questions your kind of habitual way of consuming everything around you all the time on these things. We check these 150 times a day, I heard yesterday. And something that's just basically, I like this quote. I think it might even be from Graham Harman, I'm not sure, but the idea that you encounter something in the world where you don't quite know what you're dealing with. That's a great goal for me. And so I always judge our work in the office that way. Like, is this thing too legible? Like, if we're sampling or pulling ideas from somewhere, are they there but also ambiguous? What's going on here? Is this thing that we did typologically indeterminate? Is it scale indeterminate? What is it doing exactly that's creating that kind of opacity? So that's one thing. And then to flesh out more, I guess a more totalizing architectural position. I started calling it a couple of years ago, I think about 5 years ago, architecture of a flat ontology, which has been very helpful for me in the office to clarify, both in my own head, but also to clarify with people that I work with, a kind of general idea of how to approach projects. And so what is a flat ontology? It basically means that we stop looking at architectural elements and components and parts. And parts are very crucial to all of this, or in a hierarchical way, where like you examine the site, then you do the building mass, then you figure out the interior, then you add the detailing on the exterior, and you kind of go through this weird vertical hierarchy. I'm basically saying, like, take all of those elements and flatten them out on the table. And what does that do? It actually has some kind of strange repercussions in the way that you think about things. Suddenly, you can think about interiority separately than the outer container or the mass. Circulation might get yanked out of the project entirely and dealt with separately as its own entity and then reinserted into a project. Ground is over here, and like suddenly ground is no longer that thing which is just a stage for the mass, but ground is suddenly a piece of architecture that you have to deal with independently. So I really like that, because then you have all of these entities which have their own kind of edge, boundary, and features, and then you can put them back together with all kinds of strange consequences, and it creates a lot of tension in the final object. So that basic idea has been super helpful, and I think also it helps us to break down the kind of ideas of late digital work, which had a lot to do with absolute fusion of all entities into kind of monolithic projects. Ideas about flows and everything flowing being a kind of flow of particles and everything being malleable and adaptive and all of that. And so the work that we do now is really, it's not even any longer in opposition to that, because I don't think I need a straw man to have a position here. In fact, the work just resonates for me and feels fresh and contemporary. So, yeah.
So what is your design method?
Design method, okay. Well, I guess I would say that, I run a practice, and we're really moving into building projects now, and so any method that I would have needs to both be speculative, because that's what I do, and it's important to me, but it also has to be able to deal with design criteria. So it's super important to me to approach things in a kind of double way. So and usually one pulls ahead of the other, but on the one hand, I'll approach a project kind of with a suitcase full of stuff that I want to work on over here, and that will be without Z-up gravity, without sun, without specific context, without even programmatic or typological kind of criteria over here, so working on a project. And then over here, all of those other things, which are important, as important. But I find that you can't do this first. You'll never end up at an architecture. You can and probably should do this first, but then filtering in the other criteria is crucial. So I really like this idea of kind of parallel tracks, and testing one thing against the other. And sometimes I find that the best method for working is to start with something which you're almost sure will never work with this particular site and typology. I found that works really well. If it's too similar, where you're like, oh yeah, that'll be fine, that's going to work just fine, just do that, you never get anywhere and you never make any discoveries. So I found that, again, like something where you think, for instance, we did a project this summer for Korea for our Museum of Writing. And we're like, okay, so this is a museum. We know we're going to need large, flexible spaces. We basically know kind of what we need to do, over here. And then over here, I've been really interested in keeps and castles and citadels and all kinds of things like that. And we're like, okay, so this is a modern, open civic structure, and over here keeps, castles, and these other things. And we found a way to begin to pull components and pieces off of this other interest and compile them back into something that actually worked really well as a museum, but it wasn't clear for a moment there. It was touch and go. It wasn't clear for a moment there really how that general trajectory was going to support a museum project. But what we found was that at the end, what we got was a museum that was surprising and had a whole set of strange parts and also larger flexible spaces that we would have never thought of as a museum typology. But we found, by starting over here, we found that it actually begins to break the conventional museum typology. So anyway, that's just in terms of method. And in terms of technique, also super important for my office, because we use the computer, but so does everybody. And at this point in time, I think at this what's the so-called end of the digital project, which I agree with. I don't think that using the computer in in the most, let's say, efficient way is really that helpful for architecture. So we generally will use it wrong. We use the computer not badly, but wrong. We try to break the computer, break the tools, fuse different software techniques together. We're moving around a lot between softwares. And even use, like, let's say, the wrong software to do what we want to do. For instance, a lot of the work we've been doing the last couple of years is very 8-bit, low-res, almost ancient, on purpose, because I'm trying to move away from super high-fidelity stuff, like 8 million poly surfaces and smoothness and all of these other trappings. But we're still using Maya for a lot of our massing, and we don't need Maya. That's an entertainment software, which is basically made for animating and morphing things. We don't really need that, but by doing super 8-bit low-res geometry inside of software which can do more than that, we're actually even breaking the idea of what's low-res, or breaking the possibilities of what we might do with a low-res project by using it or building it in the wrong software. So I think it's really important now for discourse, and I think it already has to a great extent, but I think it's really important for discourse to move away from this crutch of talking about the computer as if it magically generates an architecture. I don't think it does, and I think it's great fun, and my work could not exist without the computer. But I think at this time I'm just much more interested in breaking the tools. I think that's the most productive way to work. At least it is in my office.